Hey everyone, welcome back to Mimi Horror Stories. Tonight, we're bringing you another episode of spine-tingling horror tales set against the calming sound of rain. So, get comfortable. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. It was a cold winter evening, and my delivery route had taken me through unfamiliar, winding roads. The snow was falling heavily, and visibility was low. Suddenly, my GPS flickered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of a dense, dark forest. Panic set in as I realized I had no signal and no idea how to find my way back. After what felt like hours of wandering aimlessly, I saw a faint, flickering light through the trees. My heart raced as I drove towards it, hoping it was a sign of help. As I got closer, I saw an old man standing at the edge of the forest, holding a lantern. His face was weathered, and his eyes seemed to shine with an eerie light. Despite his unsettling appearance, I was relieved to see another person. "Excuse me, sir," I called out, my voice trembling. "I'm lost. Can you help me find my way back to the main road?" The old man nodded slowly and pointed down a narrow, overgrown path. "Follow this path," he said in a raspy voice. "It will lead you back to where you need to go." I thanked him and drove off, occasionally glancing in my rearview mirror to see if he was still there. But as soon as I turned the corner, he vanished without a trace. I shrugged it off as a trick of the light and continued driving, my nerves on edge. Eventually, found my way back to the main road and completed my deliveries. Later that night, I mentioned the encounter to some locals at a diner. Their faces went pale when I described the old man. "That's impossible," one of them said. "The man you saw died in a car accident on that very road years ago. People say his ghost appears to help lost travelers find their way." A chill ran down my spine as I realized I had been guided by the ghost of a man who had perished on that same road. The memory of his eerie, shining eyes still haunts me to this day. It was a typical Friday night, and I was out on my usual delivery route. I had just picked up a package from the warehouse, and my next stop was a house I had never been to before. The address was in a quiet neighborhood, but something about it seemed off. When I arrived, the house looked normal enough, though it was older and a bit run down. I walked up to the front door and knocked. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman appeared. She had a kind smile and thanked me as she took the package. I thought nothing of it and headed back to my truck. But as I reached the sidewalk, I felt a chill run down my spine. I glanced back at the house and saw the elderly woman standing in the window, staring at me with an unsettling intensity. Shrugging it off, I got into my truck and drove away. The rest of the night went smoothly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I got home, I tried to forget about it, but the image of her staring at me stayed in my mind. The next morning, curiosity got the best of me. I decided to look up the address to see if I could find any information about the house or its occupants. What I discovered left me frozen in place. The house had been abandoned for years, and the last known resident, an elderly woman, had died under mysterious circumstances. I couldn't believe it. I had seen her, talked to her, and handed her a package. My mind raced with questions. Who had I delivered to? What was in the package? And why was she staring at me so intensely? Later that day, I went back to the house to see if I could find any answers. As I approached, the door was ajar, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Stepping inside, the house was empty, covered in dust and cobwebs. There was no sign of life, no sign of anyone having been there. But then, on the floor of the living room, I saw the package I had delivered, unopened and untouched. I picked it up and left the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I never found out what was in that package, and I never went back to that neighborhood again. The experience left me shaken, and to this day, I can't explain what happened. But one thing is for sure, I'll never forget the night I delivered a package to a ghost. It was late, and I was finishing up my delivery route for the night. My last stop was a bit out of the way, down a long, winding road. After dropping off the package, I hopped back into my truck and started heading back to the main road. As I drove, I heard a faint knocking sound coming from the back of the truck. At first, I thought it might be something shifting around, so I pulled over to check. I opened the back and looked inside, but everything seemed in place. There was no sign of anything that could have caused the noise. Shrugging it off, I got back into the driver's seat and continued driving. But after a few minutes, the knocking started again, louder this time. It was a steady, rhythmic knock, like someone tapping insistently. My heart began to race, and I pulled over again, more urgently this time. I opened the back of the truck and searched every corner, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. No loose items, no animals, nothing that could explain the sound. Feeling uneasy, I decided to ignore it and just get back to the warehouse as quickly as possible. As I drove, the knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. It felt like it was coming from right behind me, and every hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned up the radio, trying to drown out the sound, but it only seemed to get louder. Finally, I reached the warehouse. I jumped out of the truck and practically ran to the back, determined to find the source of the noise once and for all. But when I opened the doors, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the eerie silence of the empty truck. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but they brushed it off as a trick of the mind, maybe caused by exhaustion. But I knew what I heard. Those knocks were real, and they haunted me for days. Every time I got into that truck, I braced myself for the knocking to start again. It never did, but the memory of that night stayed with me, a chilling reminder that sometimes, the scariest things are the ones we can't explain. It was a typical evening on my delivery route, and I had just received an order for a house I hadn't been to before. The address was in a part of town I rarely visited, but I punched it into my GPS and headed out. As I drove, I noticed the neighborhood becoming more and more run down. Finally, I arrived at the given address, only to find a charred, dilapidated structure that looked like it had burned down years ago. Confused, I double-checked the address, but it was correct. I got out of my car and walked cautiously toward the house. There was no sign of life, just the eerie remnants of what used to be a home. I was about to turn back when I noticed something on the doorstep. There, sitting perfectly intact, was the meal I was supposed to deliver. I approached slowly, my heart pounding. The meal was still warm, untouched, and neatly placed, as if someone had just set it there. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The silence was deafening, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Feeling incredibly uneasy, I decided to leave the meal on the doorstep and head back to my car. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got back to the restaurant, I reported the strange incident to my manager, who looked at me like I was crazy. It was a chilly evening, and I was nearing the end of my delivery shift. My second to last stop was a house on the outskirts of town, a place I hadn't been to before. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so. I parked my truck and walked up to the front door with the package. As I approached the house, I heard a faint, desperate cry of a baby coming from inside. My first instinct was concern. Maybe the parents needed help. I knocked on the door and waited, but there was no response. The crying continued, getting louder and more urgent. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out, "Hello? Is everything okay in there?" Still, no answer. The baby's cries were heart-wrenching, and I couldn't just leave without making sure everything was all right. I peered through the front windows, but the house seemed empty. There were no lights on, no movement inside, just the persistent sound of crying. Feeling a growing sense of unease, I decided to call the police. I explained the situation, and they assured me they would send someone to check it out. I waited by my truck, my eyes never leaving the house. The crying continued unabated, echoing in the still night air. When the police arrived, they approached the house cautiously. They knocked and called out, just as I had, but received no response. Eventually, they forced the door open and entered. I stood by, anxious to hear what they would find. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers came back out, looking puzzled. "There's no one inside," he said. "The house is completely empty. No signs of recent habitation." I was stunned. "But what about the baby crying?" I asked. The officer shook his head. "We didn't hear anything when we were inside." "Are you sure you heard a baby crying?" I insisted that I had, but their expressions told me they thought I might be mistaken. They assured me they would keep an eye on the property, but there was nothing more they could do. It was close to midnight, and I was just about to clock out when my phone rang. The dispatcher told me there was a last-minute delivery that needed to be made to a secluded area on the outskirts of town. It was unusual for such a late hour, but overtime pay was good, so I agreed to take it. I punched the address into my GPS and headed out. The roads were dark and winding, with thick trees on either side, creating an almost tunnel-like effect. The further I drove, the more isolated it felt. There were no streetlights, no houses, just the endless stretch of road. I finally arrived at the address, a small clearing with nothing but an old, abandoned-looking cabin. The place was dark, and there was no sign of anyone waiting. I parked my truck, grabbed the package, and walked up to the front door. I knocked several times, but there was no answer. The only sound was the rustling of the wind through the trees. Feeling uneasy, I'd calling the contact number provided. To my frustration, the call wouldn't go through. The number was disconnected. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The whole situation felt off. I decided to leave the package on the porch and get out of there as quickly as possible. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper coming from the trees. It was so soft that I couldn't make out any words, but it sent a chill down my spine. I quickened my pace and practically ran back to my truck. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped away. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that someone or something was watching me from the shadows. When I got back to the warehouse, I reported the incident to the dispatcher. They checked the order details and found that the contact number and address had been logged incorrectly. They assured me it was just a mix-up, but I knew there was more to it. The whispers, the disconnected number, the abandoned cabin, it all felt too real, too deliberate. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those faint whispers echoing in my mind. To this day, I avoid late-night deliveries, especially to secluded areas. The memory of that night still haunts me, a chilling reminder that some calls are better left unanswered. It was just another day on my delivery route, or so I thought. I had a package for a house I'd never delivered to before, a quaint little place on the edge of town. When I arrived, the house looked normal enough, if not a bit old and worn. I walked up to the door and knocked. A woman answered, looking a bit frazzled, but polite. She thanked me and took the package. I couldn't help but notice her eyes widen slightly when she saw the return address, but she quickly composed herself and closed the door. As I walked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I shrugged it off and continued with my deliveries. Later that night, I went home, had dinner, and went to bed, forgetting all about the strange delivery. The next morning, I stepped out to get my newspaper and nearly tripped over something on my doorstep. There, sitting on the mat, was the same old, creepy doll that had been in the package I delivered the day before. My heart skipped a beat. How did it get here? I never took it home. I picked up the doll, its porcelain face cracked and its glassy eyes staring blankly ahead. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. I took the doll inside, placed it on the table, and tried to think logically. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe the woman somehow tracked me down and left it here. But why? Feeling uneasy, I decided to take the doll back to the house. I drove back to the edge of town and knocked on the door. The same woman answered, and her face went pale when she saw the doll in my hands. "Why did you bring it back?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't," I replied. "It showed up on my doorstep this morning." She looked horrified. "This doll belonged to my grandmother. It's been in our family for generations, but it's cursed. Anyone who tries to get rid of it finds it back in their possession the next day." A wave of dread washed over me. I handed the doll to her, and she reluctantly took it. "Please, just take it back," I said. "I don't want anything to do with it." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean for this to happen." I left the house, feeling a heavy weight lift off my shoulders. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a faint tapping sound. I opened my front door, and there it was, the doll, sitting on my doorstep again. I tried everything to get rid of it. I threw it in the trash, buried it, even drove it out to the middle of nowhere and left it there. But every morning, It was back on my doorstep. The doll's presence became a terrifying constant in my life, and I couldn't escape it. Eventually, I had no choice but to accept it. The doll now sits in a glass case in my living room, a grim reminder of a delivery that went horribly wrong. And every night, as I try to sleep, I swear I can hear faint whispers, as if the doll is watching and waiting.